Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am Ebrahim Gangat and this is Salaamedia. Today we have in the studios with us Muhammad Cajee, who is Executive Director of ASRI. And we got him into the studio today. I wouldn't say we dragged him in, but we brought him in to come and tell us about all the fires that is happening around the country, the protests. Why are there so many protests, and is there any possible solution for South Africa? Let us welcome him to the program this morning. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Brother Muhammad.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Jazakallah khair for having me, and Ramadan Mubarak to Salaamedia's viewers.
Thank you so much for being with us and making some time for being with us. Brother Muhammad, let us start off by telling our viewers exactly who ASRI is, what is some of the important objectives that you are out there for, your mission statements and so forth, just very briefly.
ASRI is a public policy institute. We just over a year old now. Our mission is primarily to advocate for more just public policy in South Africa, for a better society. And that's primarily what our work relates to: domestic public policy in education, healthcare, nation building, crime and justice, and unemployment. So those are our 5 core areas.
Now, it hasn't been very pleasant in recent times. From 2004, and there's documented evidence of the number of protests. In fact, somebody's called us the protest capital of the world. We've escalated from having a very few protests up to having about 3,000 and more, about 30 a day in 1 month. And right now, if one looks around, especially in the KwaZulu-Natal Durban area, very strategic areas like your M19s, your Quarry Road, the highways where many cars are moving early in the morning, always filled with tires and fire. People are not happy at all. And can you possibly unpack for us what exactly is happening here?
I think it's twofold. Primarily, it's economic. So there's a widening gap between rich and poor in South Africa, and it's palpable. I think there's a loss of patience on the part of the poor and the marginalized in South African society. And I think that's indicated not just by the service delivery protests, but also if you look at the must fall movements, fees must fall, roads must fall. And thirdly, something broken in our political system in terms of the ability of citizens to effect change on a political level beyond elections, and seeing what's been referred to as the democratic dividend coming back to better lives for them. I think that we're at that point where most African countries have gotten to after 20 years of liberation, where that honeymoon period, if it were, has come to an end.
So what we are basically seeing now, especially working towards the local government, municipal government elections, is this something that is expected that was going to come up? Is the timing correct? Or is there in your vocabulary anything about a third force?
So I think leading up to local government elections, we are seeing a lot of these sort of protests which are related to the actual positions of power. So I think closer to local government elections, you're going to say that many of these protests, like take Durban recently, for example, the reports are saying that these are related to councillor candidates of the ANC who did not get the nomination for the positions of councillor or the PR list and so on. So I tend to agree with it. I think that leading up to the elections, it's political protests related to positions within party lists rather than service delivery protests, the way that the media have been referring to it as.
And if one looks at some of the more serious reasons as to why the protests are taking place, can we attribute this now to a more poorer group of people, informal settlement people? There were groups like the landless movements and the anti-privatization forums and the Public People's Alliance, Abahlale, Basam John Dolo. These are some of the organizations' names that come up. They're moving from the back towards this now. Would this be dedicated to a certain sector of a community in our country?
So I think, let's take one of the most recent ones, which was the Vuwani protests in the Limpopo province, right, where several schools were burnt to the ground and so on. I think in many ways those are related to uh, groups or individuals with political motives. I think that's like a dominant trend within the within this. But as I mentioned when we started, there is a strong socio-economic underpinning as well in terms of a lack of promises being kept on the part of politicians and an unhappiness. So the debate around Vuwani was should we blame those who are burning down infrastructure, or should we blame those who are in positions of government and authority of not delivering? Right. So, do you blame the victim? The victim is shouting for help to say, well, these are promises made. You haven't brought better services. The schools are the same that they are. We've just completed some research as part of our campaign around library bylaw reform, and you look at some of the libraries in Soweto, they're exactly the same as they were on the 27th of April 1994. In terms of size, in terms of the number of shelves, okay, maybe some of the books might have changed, the librarians might have changed, but if that's a example of saying what change has taken place over 20 years, if one library in Soweto is exactly the same as it was on the 27th April 1994, and if other wards in Soweto don't have libraries, and that's Joburg, right, one of the wealthiest cities in the country. What about your rural municipalities or areas where development is even less so than Gauteng or Johannesburg or our major metropolitan centers? So I think I wouldn't put it to these individual organizations like Landless People's Movement, for example, driving this. I think it's very much independent, sort of like how Fees Must Fall emerged, right? So Fees Must Fall was leaderless, it was spontaneous. You had groups of students who were initially opposing salary increases at WITS, and that sort of mushroomed to other universities across the country. And I think that beyond some of them being politically motivated in terms of unhappiness and conflict between different candidates within the same parties, others are economically motivated and pretty much spontaneous in terms of those groupings.
The modus operandis of these protests, some of which have been extremely violent, what does your research basically tell you? Why would a person that has been searching for such a long period of time, of having a school, within the confines of their living area, now go and burn down a school? I mean, to many public people sitting out there say, but this doesn't make sense to us. You wanted education, the government has given you a school, now you burned the school down. So what is the modus operandi? What have we found, perhaps even in some of the research you've done? Why is this being carried out in such a violent manner?
I think it's desperation, right? So going back to those two angles, the one angle in terms of economically disenfranchised parents or residents and so on, it's desperation. It's a call for attention. We know that when you have major service delivery protests historically, politicians do run to the area and give a voice or give an audience to those individuals or groups who are protesting. And the same thing happened with Vuwani, where those schools were burnt. That eventually the community leaders were given an audience. And remember, with Vuwani, it also related to the municipal demarcations, that the residents of that neighborhood were very unhappy with being imposed upon that their area should be part or merged with the neighboring municipality. And I think this also becomes a debate about the right to citizens to choose, which ultimately is what democracy is supposed to be there to govern or to manage. That if you go back to the Freedom Charter saying the people shall govern, the utmost realization of that is the ability of citizens to write legislation, as well as the ability of citizens to choose whether they want to be within municipalities or not. And I think that goes back to one of the earlier points I made, which is the breakdown in the political process and the process of governing. That um, what we've built is a very sort of top-down culture of governance, that the executive will write legislation or government agencies will decide what's best for the people. Um, but if Vuani wanted to be an independent municipality with 500 people, so what, right? If they wanted to be an independent municipality with, 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 people, so what, right? They have a right to choose as citizens to be governed the way that they want to, and that should be a give and take between the state and between citizens. With that particular Vuani experience, I think it was a huge level of unhappiness on the part of specific individuals, and you can't rule out that it wasn't instigated by other players in the community. But eventually, that brought the attention to the issue that they were seeking and they were looking for.
So, whose door do we actually lay the blame to, and perhaps ask Asri this morning as to what do you think are possible solutions to these problems that are facing our country now?
So I place the blame on both citizens and government. Right? On government because government has the resources and, in theory, the ability to make more informed decisions of what needs to happen and what needs to take place. So, following the mechanics of democratic process would, in theory, mean that communities have the ability to input into processes, which did take place but wasn't heeded. Like if you look at Vuani as the example, the community had made it clear that they don't want to be merged into that municipality. And yet the demarcations board ruled against it and said that it's going to happen nonetheless. So on the citizens' part, though, I think that we very much took a back seat in terms of handing over the authority and the dependence on government to do everything on our behalf. So I think a portion of the blame, if not half of the blame, lays on ourselves in terms of not playing the role of citizen advocates for better legislation in our communities, better services, keeping government accountable, and those sort of things. And one of the solutions that we've put forward in terms of USRI is physically writing legislation ourselves. Because legislation ultimately means that budgets need to be allocated towards it, and the executive, be it the mayoral committees or the provincial cabinets or the national cabinet, need to then implement that legislation because no one's above the law, and the courts impose the law as it's been passed. So one of the initiatives that we've sort of completed or are busy with in this week is the library reform bylaw as well as a petition reform bylaw, which experiments with this idea that citizens can write legislation. So we've written legislation for better libraries in Joburg, minimum norms and standards, how many libraries should be in every ward, what level of budget should be allocated by the city of Joburg to libraries, and now we actively advocating for councillors to support that legislation versus the typical way that we'll do it, which is call a march and ask the mayor to act. We want better libraries. The mayor should act. This is unprecedented in many ways because it opens a door for citizen groups, regardless of who they are, to take an issue up, table a bylaw which isn't more than 4, 5, 6 pages, and then start mobilizing for those to be adopted versus a step back, which is asking the executive again to write legislation to solve a problem.
So, Brother Mohammed, what you are basically saying is that for the future, although we cannot look into it, we can expect in the run-up towards the government elections that there are going to be many more protests. Do you think this is possibly still be happening? Because look, at this point in time, Durban is burdened, in the morning when people have to get to work and so forth. So what would you be saying to the viewers out there?
So I think that it's going to be for the next couple of weeks, because you have this election list process that's busy being felt through in terms of, unhappy camps whose candidates didn't get onto the lists or who have been defeated either fairly or unfairly by other groups. And ultimately, that's politics, right? In politics, you're always going to have a winner and a loser. It's a question of how sore the loser is and how, generous the winner is in defeat. So, when it becomes violent between factions, that's when you start worrying. But as long as it's a fair sort of campaign between different groups and factions, and next year's another campaign that's going to come up. There's the 2017 ANC National Congress, where a new leader of the ANC would have to be elected. So, I think that because the submission of the party lists closed last week, and there were obviously winners and losers within that process. Much of this is related to that sort of process in terms of party lists, and I think it would see itself through. I don't think it would be ongoing towards the elections, like on an ongoing basis. We haven't historically seen in the weeks leading up to the elections a significant level of political violence in the sense of different factions. And remember, these are factions within the same party, right? It's the factions within the ANC that have been campaigning for those positions on the party list. So I think that, within a few days or a week, it would be resolved through interventions by, Lutuli House or provincial leadership or the city leadership, and then we'd get in full swing into peaceful election campaigns as per usual. What would be interesting this year is, the entry of the EFF into municipal elections, and what impact does that have between inter-party sort of rivalries for different voters in different areas. And I think that's something that would be new and needs to be watched to see how that pans out. And then obviously the results of the election as well.
Very exciting, very innovative. Brother Muhammad Cajee is saying that we should be writing our own legislation instead of handing it over to the politicians. Citizens should be doing this to promote a better form of governance in our country. He's the executive director of ASRI, Muhammad Cajee. He was our special guest today. And he can't give us any promises, but yes, protest action we'll probably still see much more of until the run-up to the elections. I am Ebrahim Gangat, and this is Salaamedia. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.